My name is Katie Steele, and I'm the coordinator of the Southwest Hub. And my director, Emily Elias, gives her apologies. She was unable to make it today, so she's handed over to me to introduce Dave and the webinar. So thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar by Dr. Dave Dubois. Before we start, I just wanted to give those of you who have not heard of the Climate Hubs a really quick overview. In 2014, Secretary Vilsack founded 10 hubs, and our purpose is to help farmers, ranchers, foresters, and land managers adapt to the impacts of climate change. And there's 10 of us worldwide, 10 of us nationwide. And the Southwest Hub, we cover New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, Hawaii, and the US affiliated Pacific Islands in the Western Pacific. Given the complementary nature of our mission with CLIMAS, we do partner a lot with CLIMAS, and we have many shared projects with them. Dr. Dave Dubois, who is presenting today, is the state climatologist for New Mexico and a CLIMAS researcher. He is located in Las Cruces in the Plant and Environmental Sciences Department at New Mexico State University. And Dr. Dubois has a very active research program in air quality and applied climatology. And he participates and collaborates in many studies that look at quantifying the interactions of climate and pollution, as well as the origins, composition, and transport of dust and pollutants. Now, we know that the interaction between dust and agriculture and climate is not very well understood. So the Climate Hub, the Southwest Climate Hub, has funded Dave Dubois to synthesize the current knowledge on a national level and explore how current knowledge already has information on how agricultural production systems are impacted by air quality and vice versa, how air quality is impacted by production systems. So today, Dr. Dubois will present the results of this national level synthesis and with this focus on a changing climate. And I would like to recognize here too that this work is part of a larger project of the USDA Climate Hub Network, the Agricultural Research Service, and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And the purpose of this broader project is to identify, elucidate, and respond to critical questions about agricultural production and air quality under a changing climate, both of which are strongly linked to US food security, public safety, and health. Finally, some housekeeping. All attendees are muted. If you have a question, please write it in the Q&A box. We will have about 15 minutes at the end of Dr. Dubois' presentation for questions. And in the event that we lose connection from Dr. Dubois, he will call in and I will pick up the slides and advance those on his behalf. So thanks again to CLIMAS for hosting this and to Ben for all your technical support and coordination. And with that, I'll hand over to Dr. Dubois.
Thanks, Katie. I appreciate that. Yeah, if you don't know, one of our webinars in the past, a couple of weeks ago, my internet dropped out. So now we've got a contingency plan to tackle that. So let's get started. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And then we'll get rolling. Let me get that. All right. So this is basically a kind of a project summary and a little bit ongoing that it's a collaboration with the Southwest Climate Hub as well as other climate hubs in the US. I'll talk more about that, and it's a synthesis of what the connections between air quality and agriculture. So let me first talk about who is helping out with this. And I really appreciate on the left side, the program management team led by Emily, the director of the Southwest Hub, Danelle with Northern Plains, Dennis with Midwest. And then we've got Mike and Greg with USDA NRCS, as well as Nick Webb at the Jornada Experimental Range, and Sky doing a lot of the background work to make this happen. So, and on the right side, just want to highlight my wonderful students who are helping out in this project. Natalie, Autumn, Alba, Giovanni, Nicholas, Sean, Joel, and Tristan. and just congratulations to those couple who are graduating. So they've really helped me out over the past year or so, and looking up, very much learning how to do research and helping me out in this project, learning about air quality. So let's go ahead and dive in. I want to first give you a sense of background before we dig in onto the synthesis, because they will tie in some of the slides that directly into the synthesis. So the first thing we want to do is kind of give an overview of the purpose. So basically, we're synthesizing the current state of knowledge on air quality impacts on production agriculture, and vice versa. Talk about that, mixing in with weather and climate change. So we're looking at a broad range of air quality, not limited to dust, ozone, ammonia, odors, and I'll talk more about the different aspects of that. So you're taking part in one of the outputs of this project, the webinar, and then we're also doing a white paper, and then once we get that, getting comments from that, we'll submit it to, we'll draft up a manuscript. So I'm just kind of giving you an overview of where we are in the US. This is for all 50 states. We're looking at the production. I got this from the latest ag census from USDA, NASS. The 2017 data is up on the web, talking about the farms and ranch production, $388.5 billion in products. And just looking at the areas where the sales are the highest. So they're looking at the states of California, that's the top rank, $45.2 billion, and second rank, Iowa, then Texas, Nebraska, and going down. So just giving you a sense of where the production is in terms of the monetary value, sales, and when we relate that back to the air quality, it'll kind of help us synthesize where things are taking place, who's doing the work, where are the work being done. Going into not just the spatial, but the particular types of crops and agricultural commodities. The top commodities were, as we all know, if you know agriculture, it's cattle production. So in the top state is Texas, and it's about 16% of the production, the commodities of cattle and calves come from Texas. And then second down on the list is corn. Top state of that is Iowa, and then poultry, eggs, third. Fourth, soybeans, and then fifth is milk. There's other ones, but I just wanted to give you the top five for the in terms of production U.S. So where are the agricultural interests scattered all over? Well, this is a really great map that we found on the website, and I put the link here in case you want to grab these for yourself and look at those. So the latest ag census was 2017. There were over 2 million farms, and those are all the different dots. Each dot is 200 farms, and it's a decrease of about 3% since the last ag census of back in 2012. So over the past 5 years has been a 3% decline in the number of farms, and so they represent, which I was kind of surprised, 900 million acres, and that's a decrease of 2% since the last census. Just kind of give you a sense of the area. National Park Service, they have managed 85 million acres, and place where I live in the western U.S., where there's a lot of the areas, especially like Nevada. I think it's over 80% is BLM land, and there's 245 million acres managed by Bureau of Land Management. Interesting enough, in terms of stats, I won't focus a lot on this, but I did find one thing that there's actually, there's a decrease in the number of farms, but it actually depends on the size. There's actually an increase, 22% increase in the small farms, so 1 to 9 acres. And then an increase also in the large farms, more than 2,000 acres, so the 4% increase there, but 22% increase in the small farms. So that's kind of a significant point there. We can talk about that later. So going into the air quality parts. So, I mean, I grew up on a farm. They manage right now more than 2,000 acres of row crops and things. My parents, they're their backyard is filled with corn right now. And so I'm familiar with what goes on these, and we need to be able to quantify as well as, do our food production in a good stewardship way. So we need to be able to figure out what are the impacts to our human health as well as the ecosystem. So it can go both ways, that which we'll talk about. So what are the pollutants that we're going to be looking at? So the first group those are regulated by the US EPA. So those include PM 2.5, PM 10, ozone, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and lead. And we've found through our literature review, a lot of the work is being done in ozone and particulates. And there's actually a lot of overlap in there, because we'll talk about that. There are gases that form in the atmosphere that create both ozone and particulates. So there's a lot of synthesis going on already just in the atmosphere. And the other part is other gaseous pollutants of concern. VOC, they're the volatile organic compounds that we produce, humans, and as well as that are out there in the natural environment. Those we call biogenic. Those are the forests, the soils, things like that. As well as ammonia, we consider methane, CO2, and N2O. So, like I said, a lot of these are they're related in the atmosphere. They have pathways that form ozone, which is a gas, and particulate matter in the atmosphere. So we want to look at both of those. So I just wanted to this is kind of our direction of our path in terms of our research is we're looking at the air quality burden, which is measured by the concentrations of pollutants. So in states and EPA measure this, they have air quality monitoring stations that measure all the criteria pollutants, and most of them are done. The gaseous pollutants are measured on an hourly basis, and then the particulates are measured on a 24-hour, although there are real-time particulate matter measurements. So that's the measurements of the air quality burden. And then on the other side, we've got the activities the sources and sinks that agricultural production provides. And then we've got the exchange of pollutants between the two. So that we've got agricultural activities create these criteria pollutants as well as the other gases, and then the impacts of other areas, sources. So like every time we drive a car, we're emitting volatile organic compounds, nitrogen species, we call those NOx, which is NO and NO2, as well as a bunch of other unburned hydrocarbons. And they go somewhere. They may convert in the atmosphere to some other species, but they also can impact through deposition and creation of ozone that impact agriculture. And we'll talk about both of these pathways when we look at the literature review. So let's kind of dig in, kind of just do a sweep on the types of emissions. I just grabbed these photos from our family farm in New Jersey. Everything from preparing the soil, getting the fields ready for planting, to maintenance activities, irrigation, and then also the harvesting process, which could be a lot of different ways. And then also when we get dry conditions, drought episodes, we can get wind erosion from agricultural lands as well as other lands. And then also just the activities that go on agricultural lands, such as unpaved road dust, paved roads that are adjacent to the agricultural areas, and then there's a ton of other different fugitive dust sources. I'm not going to. The point is just to mention those. I'm not going to go into great detail. I just wanted to show you one example of one in my backyard here in New Mexico. We have a sizable pecan production area, and this is one of the examples of our harvesting that's done in the late fall that we can usually see these. So that's just an example of what we see in action in our backyards. And we also we looked at a lot in terms of what has been published in terms of supporting regulatory decisions. So a lot of the research we found, we were looking at, we also looked at who did the research as well as some of the funding. How do they get funding? So a lot of the manuscripts they put in their what contracts and what grants they got. So we recorded some of those, and a lot of them were they were pure research to support production yields, but there were also a number that were quite sizable number that were to support regulatory decision making. So here's an example of one that was done a few years ago to estimate and to compile. It was sort of a synthesis project in itself to look at emission factors for PM10. Well, that's this particular matter less than or equal to 10 microns aerodynamic size. And so that they needed these numbers as a way for decision makers to use the best available numbers. So this is one of the, so if you're interested in getting the a pretty good source of emission factors, or there are a bunch out there. And also EPA has a quite a sizable archive. They're called AP42, which also has a lot of technical support documents that have quite a bit of research to back those up. They try to make them simple as possible for the practitioner to use, but they do have research that some of it was funded by EPA, but a lot of it wasn't. Maybe states and other USDA entities have funded it. So this is kind of another source of information that is available to look at the impacts of agriculture, both directions, or just looking at the emission factors that are out there. And some of them are actually supporting the state implementation plans when states are out of compliance with, say, the PM 2.5 or the PM 10 standards or other standards. And some of that decision making is required to maybe develop regionally specific emission factors, considering. So like some of these were developed for the state of California for their SIPs. You know, a few years old, but they're still some of these are the best available. So we also got to think about the natural processes that go on. Wind erosion, just example, when we get dry, loose, finely divided soil, not a lot of cover, so smooth exposed surfaces, and a lot of open areas without obstructions. And of course, we need the final part of the recipe is strong winds and dry conditions. So in other parts we were looking at is the part that that part is the production of animals from feedlots, animal feeding areas, CAFOs, that those are more than 1,000 animal units, dairies, poultry, range cattle production. A lot of that's in a lot of the Western U.S. That's a big part of it. And then swine, sheep, goats, and horse production. So those are all the ones that we're doing, looking at keywords and doing our synthesizing from. And then we got to also look at not only the crustal part, but the combustion. So anything that produces combustion products, and it's mainly like black carbon or NO2 pollution. So everything from biomass burning to when we dry the commodities, corn, soybean grain dryers, example one right here, as well as the actual engines on the mobile source. So light duty to heavy duty vehicles, all the haul trucks, the semis that move commodities from place to place. And then the harvesting equipment, tractors, harvesters, haul trucks, and then as well as the irrigation pumps, which are in some places have quite a bit of those. So all those are part of our sweep of looking at emissions. So what are we talked a little bit about the emissions, but what is actually viewed? So this is a kind of broad sweep, regionally look at PM 2.5 across the US. And I didn't do all the regions, I just picked 5 of them. So starting over here and on the northeast part here, you can see that 47% increase from 2000 to 2008 over, and you can see that the trend going clockwise, looking at the southeast, there's a 50% decrease in regionally average PM 2.5, and this dashed line is a national standard. At the bottom here, we've got the south, which which are, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, a 30% decrease in the regionally average PM 2.5. If you go further onto the West Coast, 19% decrease in regionally average PM 2.5. And then finally, the only one I'll show, I only had space to put a few, the Northwest, it's a 9% decrease. So less of a decrease. And some of that, a lot of the variations are due not only by emissions, but the meteorology is a big part of this as well. But we're looking at long-term trends. A lot of that's from reduction in actually the emissions. So I don't want to go too much into this one, but I need to mention it in terms of where does the aerosols, because when we're talking about ozone, that's one gas, that's one molecule type, O3. But when we talk about aerosols, they just come in a ton of varieties depending on the source. So right below aerosols, we got main categories from what we like dust, the fugitive dust, the crustal. These are parts of like aluminum, silicon, potassium, iron, things like that. And then we got one classified nitrate, which here's kind of the formation pathway. We're really general, nitric acid, ammonia, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And then see, these are some of the precursors, like meaning that what gases that form, like things that make up the nitric acid. And then we've got the other category, sulfate. A lot of those are from when we burn coal and oil. We usually get a lot of sulfur dioxide, but there's other pathways as well. And then the other big part of the aerosol is organic carbon. So those are the burning, and a lot of it's burning, but there's also those are biogenic components that form in like things in forests, for instance. So with terpenes and isoprene as some of the example precursors, and then as well as we got mobile sources as well, in addition to biomass burning. So I just wanted to kind of go through that because aerosols are a pretty complicated mixture of things, and they vary from place to place. And sometimes they vary quite a bit, and then in some areas of the U.S. they slowly vary. Most of the areas are the same, but you can get hotspots, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So and one of the precursors that is important is ammonia. So where are those sources? And this is from the 2017 National Emission Inventory that was published just last month. About 80%, a little more, 82% of the emissions are from the agricultural sector. So it's one of the things we need to keep tabs on. So what are things that contribute to aerosols? And the second largest are fires, both prescribed and wildfires. So keep that in mind when we talk a little bit more about the actual aerosols. And this is a precursor, this is a gas. So this is kind of, I use this in my class. So what are the pathways that go from gas phase to particulates? So we can form, this is kind of the origins of the nitrate fine aerosols, and mostly those are less than 2.5 microns. And so this process is favored during the cool season, wet, fog. So here are gas phase conditions to convert NO2 to nitrate, N2O5, as well as NO2 in creating nitric acid. And then that's mixed in the aqueous phase droplets, so like fog droplets, as well as mixing in gaseous ammonia. So that is absorbed into the droplets. And then this is kind of the reactions. They're very fast, making nitric acid and ammonium nitrate. And so, once it's created, you have ammonium nitrate aqueous solution, but then you can evaporate that and make aerosols. So that's kind of the issue here is it's sort of a little vessel to create pretty fast reactions to form aerosols. So once you dry that out, you shift to equilibrium toward the aerosol phase when we evaporate the droplets. So that's one of the reasons why we look at this. So what does the nitrate PM2.5 look like across the country? Well, here's the legend. So the bigger numbers are the blues, the less are the reds. So mostly in the middle of the country are the higher nitrates. So keep that in mind. This is These are from the PM 2.5 mass from the mostly improved network. There's other chemical speciation networks here. So what does it actually look like when we look at it as in 1 year? So this is in Fresno in the San Joaquin Valley. The reds are the ammonium nitrate. So we get, you can really see it without even look at the specific times. The cool times of the year is when we get a lot of ammonium nitrate creating light scattering. This is for visibility. And then the summer, you got this organic, that's fires. And so, and that's pretty common across some of these areas like Fresno. But if we go in sort of the middle of the country, here's in Iowa, Lake Sajima. The same colors, the red is ammonium nitrate. However, the yellows pop up, that's the ammonium sulfate. As well as, you know, the organic mass is about the same, not as evident seasonal, but nitrate really pops up in the cool seasons for both of those areas. Another component is soil. So these are the elemental composition of the particulates. So this is just an example of Cedar Bluff in the middle of the country. We've seen that the fine dust this is published just a couple years ago, that the fine dust are starting to increase significantly at sites across the central U.S. during the summer and fall. And I just picked one example that just kind of illustrate that. So the soil is this brownish, and you can see them pop up in the warm season. And the red is ammonium nitrate, yellow is ammonium sulfate. So you can see that shift from the cool season to warm season, where you get a lot more soil, and it's from the various sources. In the spring, you get a lot of wind erosion. You get the frontal systems bringing high winds. So there, some of these episodes are from, but then a lot of other ones aren't. So that's one reason why we're looking at this. And then let's kind of transition to ozone. So same regions across the country. So Northeast, seeing an 18% decrease. Southeast, 24% decrease. South, 20% decrease. 10% decrease in the West. And however, Northwest actually has an overall 8% increase in regionally average ozone here. So it's something to take note of. However, you know, there's a lot of strides we won a lot in terms of the trends across some of these really polluted areas that have been mostly impacted by urban sources like cars and industry. However, some of these do have a really big sizable agricultural input on a small region area. So this is actually the summarizing the ozone instruments in the San Joaquin Valley, one of the biggest, most productive agriculture areas in the country. Seeing this is the trends of ozone, 1 hour ozone had been trending down since they've been taking measurements in the middle 70s. So there's a lot of, a lot of that is due to the hard work, implementation of plans for reducing ozone, looking at the urban sources. But we need to look at now, once we get really good emission controls on cars, what is next? So that's one of the things as a regulator they have to worry about. What are the other sources out there that we can address cars and industry, but what else is there? So other things we found is odor pollution, and that's a really difficult one to quantify, but there's definitely a lot of impacts from odor. And I just kind of, from one of the textbooks, just kind of picked some of the commonly found chemicals and what they smell like, and then the odor thresholds. And some of them are very small in terms of part per billion concentrations that, and we don't have standards for these in terms of like criteria pollutants, but we have nuisance areas, and that's why we have things like setbacks for production areas with say mixing in the urban interface. So that's one of the complementary things that we need to know are how far away. I mean, even here in Las Cruces where I am, at times I could smell cattle from where I am. I'm not on campus, but it's more of, when the wind blows a certain direction, and it's sort of that, we need to keep in mind of that in especially urban areas. So we got to look at where are some of the other gaseous pollutants from, and some of them are pollutants and they're kind of mixture in. It's part of the nitrogen cycle, and just an example of that from soils, and that because we're also looking at sort of like right now the catchword we see a lot of regenerative agriculture. So what goes into that? What are the processes? And I just picked this really good example of the nitrogen cycle that we first get input of N2 and as well as nitrogen from lightning as an example. Then where does it go once it gets absorbed in? It mixes in with the microbial, the bacteria, creating, getting things started, but we're looking at mainly what are the fluxes from the soil up, from like NO, NO2, ammonia, and N2O. And there's another gas that's been researched is nitrous acid, HONO, can be formed when in acidic soils containing elevated nitrates. So when we have over fertilized, you can get these to form. And HONO is a really powerful ozone precursor. And then we want to look at the other direction, right? What are the impacts of air quality on plants? And just example of the air quality injury versus the impacts. It goes from nutritional value all the way up to physiological response. And we've seen all of these in the past. But what is really going on? There's been some research on the physiological changes so how does the plants exchange water vapor, oxygen, CO2, as well as letting in other gases like ozone into the stomates through the stomatal response, and then how it impacts the generation of sugars in, say, the parenchyma layers. So there's a lot of research that's being done, but there's still more in terms of the what are the sort of the acute injuries when we get spikes and say, it's low level, but then we get a week of really high ozone, for instance. We could get that in like a drought scenario. So that's a lot of what's going on. So moving on to the kind of questions I gave to my students. So I don't mean to go through all of these questions, but these are some of the, so how do you do a synthesis of, looking at connections, emerging themes, the commonalities, groupings, what are some of the things that are repeated, the replications with statements, overlapping ideas, and then also looking at knowledge gaps. So once you get into, they spent a year doing this, so they got a good sense of where things are, and then looking at geography and time, and what is going on, and are there any other synthesizing efforts that we can combine. So this is kind of where we are in this, these are the number of articles that have been published, and I colored it by the red is the air pollutants affecting ag. So input, like for instance, like just think through like that ozone impacting, giving foliar damage. What are how many articles are written on yield changes through increasing ozone, or looking at acute exposure through different gases, or ammonia, how does that affect yield in some areas? So that's the red, and then the blue are the other direction. So how has agriculture in its many ways produced pollution that impacts human health, and that's how it's measured. So that's the blue. So going on, all the way since the 1938 was kind of our first one, but mainly it's been picking up in the 90s and 2000s. So it's when it's really going on. So when we partition them out in terms of the number of papers by different crops. So on the left side is the agriculture impacts on air pollution. And majority of the papers have been written, published, and a lot of it we're focusing on peer reviewed, although we do have, we do look a lot at the gray literature as well, but we're focusing mainly on the peer review or particulate matter. So the 31% in PM2.5 and a quarter of all the papers in PM10. And then next is ammonia, spray drift, from pesticides and NOx and ozone, and then a ton of a bunch of others. So particulates is pretty much the majority. And on the right side or the other direction. So the pollution impacts on agriculture, and the majority of the papers have been published is ozone. So about almost half of all the literature that we found is basically how has ozone impacted agriculture? How is it? And most of them have shown decreases in yields worldwide, because we have found a lot of papers that are written in Asia and Europe seeing the same things, and then some of the papers are global in nature, doing larger scale. And then also the other almost a quarter of a little less than a quarter, 21% or particulate matter, and then the whole gamut of different pollutants. So there's quite a bit of spread in the other pollutant, but PM, particulate matter, and ozone were by far the most frequently found. So I just we're just doing some brainstorming and data analysis and showing some visualization. So I mean, it's a common thing is done to a word cloud on the ag impacts on pollution. We're just kind of seeing where are things, what are getting a gist of all this. These are all the keywords. So what we did is we went through we read every paper, we summarized them, and then we provided our own keywords for every paper, and then catalog them, and then that's the result of all of our work in all the keywords was this word cloud seeing pop up. Most frequent words, which makes sense: PM2.5, PM10, emissions, cotton. There was a lot of cotton articles we found. And going to the other direction, pollution impacts on ag, a little bit different, but it was basically reaffirming the number of articles. Ozone, most popular, then dust came up, pollution and change, part of climate change. So those were our big takeaways. So I just want to kind of break out some of the details on here in terms of some of the specific crops. So cattle, I don't mean to read all these, and I'll give you the PowerPoint of these, but basically we broke it down for cattle and CAFOs, cattle, dairy, and beef. Most of the work has been published in ammonia, PM2.5 and PM10. Looking at the actual production as well as the excrements, where all the waste goes. And so a lot of the work, I think one of the takeaways is, we looked at some of the emission studies. There's, I think one of the bigger questions is we need more longer term monitoring to understand the trends and what goes on in certain different areas. Remember that picture of the cow and the droplet? That kind of reaction favors a cool climate during the winter time. Of course, we get that all over the place, but a high humidity and then the fog. But say where are the trends of that? And we can get those from the improved data set and some of the other chemical speciation networks. But what about other areas that we are concerned about? So those are some of the takeaways on tracking that, and then a lot of the west to Midwest geographic area. Looking at swine, just looking at focus of studies was a lot of what came up was ammonia and particulate matter were the biggest contributors to the published research. Little is done in the terms of mitigation, such as changing the diet of the swine. I've seen some newer reports that weren't in our mix, but I think that's just, some of those are just getting started. So the main pollutants, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, PM, and methane. So and some of the knowledge gaps are, including like the diets, mitigation measures, and when there's a need for long-term studies. And we know where those are in the Midwest and U.S. East and Southeast. So let's move on to wheat.
So Dave, I'm just going to interject. You've got just under 10 minutes.
Awesome. Almost. We've got about 10 minutes left. So great. Thank you for that. Winter wheat was our most common paper published. Most of these dealing with ozone impacts, looking at yield, plant health, yield. Um, so a lot of deal with impacts of climate change is another emerging topic, looking at increasing. So what in a world with increasing CO2 concentrations and changing in temperatures, what are some of the yield results? So those are some of the looking at stress on wheat. So, and a lot of this not only in the U.S. but looking at the bottom here in the geographic area, there's research done globally. India, China are some of the big producers of a lot of research. Looking at more impacts of, say, ozone, even though we've had ozone decreases, there's still a lot in terms of the impacts. They're still there, even with the lower ozone concentrations on wheat crops. So that's another takeaway that is important. Even though there's great strides, there's still impacts. Rice is another one we looked at. Asian rice, Orza sativa was the species. So most of the research that we found were addressing methane emissions on anaerobic conditions. A lot of the research was basically overseas. A lot of the, I think there needs to be some locally, along the Mississippi River area, big rice production area there. That's a knowledge gap in terms of, so how do we apply the research that's going on in other continents to the U.S. Cotton, we found a lot of cotton papers, a lot of mitigation type of work. However, there's very little on the production, the field production producing pollutants, mainly the ginning, or the predominantly the publications. Not a lot of long-term studies. Other countries have looked at N2O for climate change, looking at the field N2O measurements. Little else, not much. That's one of the recommendations, looking at the production areas. US, Midwest, Southwest, Southeast, China, Turkey, and Australia, where it kind of popped up as a research. Just got a couple more. Corn, looking at CO2 and ozone combined. We saw a bunch of papers on that in terms of corn growth and yield, and looking at how much is good, how much is at what levels injures the plants. Not a lot of long-term studies. N2O was found looking at fertilizers, so we need to look. That's another area we need to look more into. Looking at main pollutants, more broadly, CO2, actually a lot of more gases, looking at both impacts on, a lot of it's combined with soils as well as the impacts from outside of the agricultural community, ozone. So we move to alfalfa. Mostly the research focused in on ozone, carbon dioxide, and sulfur dioxide. A bunch of older papers on this SO2, looking at measuring foliar production, looking at how, with the current levels of air pollution, what are some of the other things that it struggles with, not only air pollution, but also water quality and water quantity, drought. It's another thing, looking at when it's drought stressed, how does it respond to increasing pollution or the change in pollution? So there's big work done there, but a lot of those stuff has been published decades ago. Fewer newer studies published on the air quality side of things. So, and kind of, I think the last one on this one, the peanuts, lack of not a lot of research done on that. We have some on PM and ammonia NOx, mainly from the 70s to the 60s. The majority come from, are very regionally, that's basically where a lot of the production is, but from North Carolina. Majority focus ozone, limited other subjects. So not much produced in peanuts. Another one I didn't talk about, is pecans. Some of the other nuts, like almonds, have a bit more, but pecans, very little done on the air quality impacts. And there's a bunch of others. If I had more time to go in this, it'll be summarized in this synthesis paper in the article. But I just want to give you a flavor of where we are, the direction we're heading. We're basically going to cut bait at 2019. And, you know, it's sort of like it's tempting to keep putting more and more. You never get finished with this kind of work, but we have to say at some point it's okay. We're not going to do any more. We're distill what we've got. So even though there's a bunch of really cool stuff going on in 2020, we can move that on in another 5 years, do another update on this. But it's basically from 1930s to 2019, looking at what is going on and where we think we are and what's been published. So that's our summary of this. And then we want to get feedback from the community and then and throw this out to get published. So I just want to mention our great funding from the USDA, and split it up into two different funding. Actually, it's one project, but it's come from two different places, the ARS as well as the NRCS. There's our numbers. And well, great. That's I'll end with this great slide of some production tomatoes from New Jersey. So so there's my contact email. I do a lot on Twitter, so if you want to follow me, you can hear all about air quality and what goes on, and mainly focus on New Mexico, but I'll talk about anything. So I really appreciate you listening in, and I'll open up the questions.
Thanks, Dave. We already have a couple of questions. One is from Bill Zacharias, and it's a very relevant question, I think, to those of us who do talk about ground level ozone, because I've certainly had this question before as well. So Bill was wondering about the protective ozone layer of the atmosphere and the relationship, if any, here at ground level.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Really good question. I get a lot of that kind of question. So we've got two. Most of the ozone in the entire Earth is in the stratosphere. So that's above the area that we breathe, starting in the different, the elevation of that starts, 14, 15 kilometers above us in mid latitudes. And we want to keep all that up there. That protects us from the ultraviolet exposure. At the ground where we live, where we breathe, is a whole different chemistry. It's still ozone, O3. However, it's formed from sunlight, organic compounds, as well as nitrogen species, NO, NO2, and a few other compounds that we do. It's some part of that is naturally biogenic, but then we add a whole lot. Every time we turn a vehicle on, our power plants, as well as the soils itself as background, that's the generation of we call photochemical ozone. So there's no ozone generators. We don't have a bunch of those little cleaners in our house. In the ambient air, it's all created through chemistry of the atmosphere. And so we don't want the ozone. We want to reduce the ozone near the ground, but increase the ozone above us. We want to keep that stratosphere the way it is, but we want to reduce the ozone on the ground, because that's definitely a health problem. A lot of people are very sensitive to ozone near the ground. And this is the time of year we get that. We got a lot more sunlight, warm temperatures, a lot of production of ozone in the summer. Usually starts in some places as early as April and goes all the way to September is our ozone season in some of the southern parts of the country. So that's and it's driven by human health, a lot of it. But as we learn, we're seeing a lot of impacts of ozone on production. We're losing quite a bit of yield from ozone, from that ozone that we're contributing to.
Thanks, Dave. So here's another question for you from Tony Clem. Tony asked, did you find any differences in air quality between organic and conventional agriculture, and includes crop, fruit, veg, and animal?
Yeah, really good question. Difference between organic and conventional agriculture. I think that's there. I mean, it's been around a while, organic. And there are some publications, and a lot of it's actually, they haven't really focused a lot on air quality. They look mainly at the soil health, which is great. I mean, I'm 100% behind more research and looking at soil health, carbon sequestration, but there hasn't been a lot of connection above the soil layer. And I think that is another takeaway is how has the what goes on above the soil. I think that's a big thing. And I think looking at the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, sulfur cycle, all those are integrated and they're connected. In looking at the biota as well as the inorganic and organic, that's all part of the. You really have to understand all that and to really see the fluxes, the gases coming off of it, and then that's once we get a feeling of that, I think we get a better sense of how if we do creating models to look at, so if we increase the carbon content using types of no-till or reduced till, how does that increase in carbon in other species, looking at the mycorrhizal composition, bringing that up. So how does that trickle down to looking at NO and if in some areas, producing methane or ammonia. So it's still a lot of research needs to be done in that. So I'm glad you brought up that question.
Presumably there would be a difference when you're looking at different tillage methods as well, some that leave standing biomass.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so we have another question here from Sandy Barr. And Sandy asks, have you looked at the effectiveness of agricultural best management practices relative to reducing pollutants? For example, there are BMPs for PM10 in the Phoenix area, but it is unclear what the impact has been.
Yeah. Actually, we're looking at that. And one of the big areas is since, cattle is one of our big, the majority of the production funds are going in, I live not that far away from one of the CAFOs. There's a group here, and one of the issues is, that there's an evening particulate spike that goes on. And this is, I've driven through Heifer, Texas, in that same evening time, and it's quite a bit of pollution. In order to, and I've read a lot on terms of the best management practices. A lot of there's been there's a lot of publications with Texas A&M Extension looking at, so what are the problems, how bad is it, and then if we start to look at the different management of the cattle, because that's kind of the time when they get more active. It's cooling off right around when the sun's going down, as well as the stability of the atmosphere is changing. So there's sort of a the storm is kind of picking up when, making more impacts to the kind of area around it. So that's just one example of BMPs. There are some really good successes on that, but I think there's another area where we need to really put more effort in, especially when we're dealing with urban encroaching in on agriculture. Where I grew up, we had to pump a lot of the water out, and we had a lot of diesel pumps, and and people move in from the urban areas in our backyard where I grew up. We had to put houses around all the irrigation pumps because it was too loud. So it's one of those, that's a best management practice. If you're going to put an irrigation pump, it's a nuisance problem. It's not air quality, but it's more of that, that is one of the starts, is engaging communities as well as figuring out where do we get the funds to do these kind of things.
I like your comment about the irrigation pump. I live next to one and it's running right now. And when we have an inversion, the whole valley fills up with blue smoke. Yeah. Thanks, Dave. Margaret here has a question about the older research. And she asks, how valid is older research with plants in view of the increase in concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide and the known effects of CO2 on photosynthesis and plant growth?
Yeah, really good question. When I started in this field, the CO2 concentration was a lot less than it is now. And some of the older papers, I think but the good thing about it is that there's a lot of research done right now in looking at the physiology changes with increasing CO2. It's important to do a more holistic view of it, though. It's not just varying one parameter. I know some of the work is being done in greenhouses, doing kind of drought stress, higher temperatures, and CO2 changes, and in addition to the other gases. So I think some of those have a limited applicability. The older, they are just looking at if we just vary the CO2, but I think it's a little more than that. I'm not a plant physiologist at all, but I'm just seeing what we need to come up with this similar conditions that we're going to be seeing in the future to kind of give a planning in terms of how are things going to respond.
Yes, I agree. I think some of the older research is critical because it gives us the classic
Yep.
View, and a lot of the older research, as is the current research, founded in physics. So it's not just an understanding of the statistical relationships. So the oldest research is valuable, but definitely we need more now with which pays more attention to increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide and where we expect them to be in the future. But thanks, Dave. Got a couple more questions here. So Karen asks, and this is a really good question. I hear lots of discussion about this. It's kind of related to what we've been talking about, but Karen asks, we hear reports on the role cattle play in producing greenhouse gases. Reported percentages range from small to large. So what is the real story?
That's a really, I like that question. I wish I had more time to address that. I actually hear you. I hear you. I've read a bunch of things, and there's one side of the story, and then I hear on a trade journal totally opposite. So I think one of the things we need to make sure that the numbers come from a reputable source, and I think we're getting a sense of what those numbers are now, and I think they can be. I've looked at some of the published papers, and we have a fairly good sense of the for like methane, what the contributions are, but it depends on what they eat, the stress. I know I'm not an animal scientist at all. That could be another webinar in itself. So I don't have enough to give you that right now. We do have it compiled in terms of the emission factors and the research out there. So I know that's not a really good answer on that, but that is a problem. We're seeing different numbers out there, and I think I was included in on an email conversation on this a year or two ago, and it was these are all PhD scientists. They were arguing on the impacts of that. So there needs to be, I think, more common education on this. So I think, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Dave. I think that's a fair answer, given, as you say, you're a climatologist as opposed to an animal scientist. I'd like to add something for Karen here, and I think there's many different moving parts to the equation. So there's not only what the cows produce themselves out of their other end, there's also everything associated with growing beef. So where you're buying the feed, is it coming from the Midwest, or are you raising hay locally? And what kind of contribution do cows have in managing the natural landscape? Because we know that grazing cattle play a really important role in managing rangelands in the West. So there's so many moving parts that it would be good to perhaps have a webinar on this. And I've written it down in my things to do list.
Excellent idea.
Yes. We'll have a panel of folks giving their opinions for you. So watch this space. One last question from Greg. Greg asks, during the COVID-19 era, do you foresee any major changes in how we manage waste, work the land, harvest, house livestock, or other traditional agricultural practices? And if yes, what practices and how would this change? I
think we are, I don't know. I mean, that's a really good question, but I think we're more aware of what's going on. I mean, just on the public side, I mean, maps tell a lot. What are that? Just educating people on the impacts of air quality and the impacts of what people do. I mean, that's probably the biggest thing is from COVID-19 is kind of the awareness. As we're not driving. Beside the fact that there's less accidents on the road, there's less NO2 being produced. Air quality is in a lot of places, gotten a lot better. It's gone back up again in a lot of those places, but I think I don't know if in terms of management of agricultural practices it's going to change. It may. That would be a really good study, is to look at how with I think a lot of things are going to change because of the economics. I do a lot of work in drought, and I get a lot of emails about how has the drought and COVID-19 been impacting production, and it's there's quite a bit of impact in terms of less need, less people working. So yeah, I would say stay tuned for that one too.
Yeah, I agree. One thing that I see come up a lot in my Facebook feed is this need for cattle growers, for example, to have more access to their own, to be able to sell themselves. So instead of all the meat going off to the packing plants and basically cattle growers losing thousands of dollars per head, while we see meat producers making so much money. But that's probably going off on a bit of a tangent. I think rather than seeing so much immediate change in practice, that we see immediate change in consumer behavior and them growing their own food.
Yeah, and Greg kind of narrows it down in terms of looking at the composting, dealing with bioaerosols. And that was another thread. I didn't really go into it all, but there's a lot of work being done in, the composition of the material, manure waste, water, it's multimodal multimedia. Water, wastewater, it evaporates, it brings the material, whatever's in the water, and then that is transported either through rain processes or wind erosion, and then as well as, the outgassing and other things that go on. So I don't know, that is a really good question. I've seen a lot of work in windrow composting, and I don't know if there's a lot of, I'm not in the know of in terms of regulations on how that is managed, but that may be something I think it's definitely worth looking into, is that issue in terms of setbacks. I've worked in a regulatory agency for a few years and know, how do we permit things? How close do we need to be safe in terms of human health, as well as, when we look in the future, if we're looking at it right, we may be seeing more extreme rain events. So how is that going to impact, permitting and looking at not only water, but air quality impacts? Really good questions.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we see a lot of changes coming into the system as a result, positive changes coming to the system as a result of COVID-19. There has to be a silver lining. Well, Dave, I don't see any more questions. I'll just check the chat box, and I don't see any.
I need to mention Dave Brown at the beginning of our project. Dave Brown was part of our management, and so I apologize, Dave, if you're on. You were there, and we miss you.
We do. We miss you, Dave. So with that being said, we've reached there's 3 chats now. It's all Dave Brown. Okay. We'll give him a hard time when we go offline. Dave Brown was a former colleague from the Southern Plains who now works over in Tucson, still for the federal government and still in environment and climate. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. And we had some really good questions from the audience here, and do watch this space with respect to upcoming webinars. You've given us some food for thought. So thanks again, and thanks, Dave.
Yep, my pleasure.